Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this opening day. We're really excited you're all here. I've had some really great conversations with these women already, and I can tell you we all believe that this is such an important topic that we all want to think critically and thoughtfully about, and we hope to do that in our conversation today. But also leave ample time for Q&A at the end. So if you've got questions, definitely think of them as we go, but save them for the end. My name is Versha Sharma. I am the managing editor and senior correspondent at Now This, where gun violence is one of our core issues that we cover on a weekly, if not daily basis, and the different ways that it impacts communities. And I'm really happy to say that we have an all-star panel of diverse voices with us today. So we have Akoto Ofori-Atta, who is senior editor at The Trace, which does amazing work on gun violence reporting. If you're not already familiar, they also have amazing newsletters. I highly recommend them. Sign up for them.
I like that plug.
We have Lori Shantz, who is an instructor of journalism at the University of Oregon, who has a lot to share with us today from an academic and research perspective, especially. And we have Delaney Tarr, who is a graduate of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, who was a journalism student there this February when the mass shooting happened. And she's since become one of the leading voices in the March for Our Lives movement. And we're really happy to have all of you here with us today. So thank you for joining us. Great. Just to kick things off, in your own words, I'd love for each of you to share a little bit about the work and your background.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all. So as Versha mentioned, I'm a senior editor at The Trace. We are the only newsroom in the country dedicated to full-time coverage of gun violence. We are a single-issue news site. And so that means that we cover shootings like what happened in Parkland, we cover shootings like what happened in Santa Fe and what happened in Las Vegas last fall. But because those represent less than 2% of our gun deaths in this country, we fill our time really trying to understand the other 98%. And here's what that looks like. Suicides comprise 2/3 of our gun deaths in this country. There are high rates of homicide, particularly of Black and brown men in cities across the country. We are invested in understanding the links between domestic violence and gun violence as well, and also accidental shootings, non-fatal shootings, and what it means to effectively police gun crime. So in between the big stories that sort of grip our attention and catch our headlines, these are the things that we're working on every single day, and I'm very eager to talk with you all about what we think media could be doing more of as it relates to this issue.
I'm here because on October 1st, 2015, a gunman walked into a classroom at Umpqua Community College in Roseburg, Oregon, which is about an hour south of the University of Oregon campus where I teach. 3 of my students were called by national news outlets to go down and cover it. 2 of our young alums were reporters in Roseburg. Neither had been on the job for even a year, and this became their first time job. And I was with another group of students at a conference in Portland about engagement journalism and the relationships between communities and journalists who cover them. And the confluence of all of those things made me realize I needed to know more about how to teach and how to cover mass shootings and mass tragedies. So a colleague at the University of Oregon, Nicole Dahman, and I have spent a chunk of time interviewing journalists who covered that to learn how to better do this. And that in turn led me to look really closely at the academic research, not just in communication or in journalism, but in social science and criminology, to take a look at what's really happening. And I'm here to talk about all of those pieces today.
I've spent the past 4 years largely with a camera in my hand, covering pretty much every event that happened at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And that was what I knew. That was my life. I was a part of the student news broadcast, and I was a part of the student newspaper. And it was only natural for me after the shooting at my school on February 14th to turn to the media. I began doing interviews. I was very outspoken about my anger and my grief, and quickly it turned into something more. I joined the March for Our Lives, and since then we've been working tirelessly to combat gun violence of all forms and all types, to really just become as inclusive as possible in creating a more peaceful country.
So at Now This, I actually went to Parkland the day after that shooting happened. We were one of the first crews on the ground, but by no means the only crew, which is one of the things we're going to talk about here. I met David Hogg and Cameron Caskey that first day, and a few days later our team met Delaney. So being a journalist who's actually on the ground in the field after a mass shooting, after a tragedy like this, one of the things that you have to learn to navigate is the fine line between reporting and grief tourism, which we see a lot of news outlets engage in, and we see how that affects the audiences, the communities we report on, and of course victims and families of victims. I distinctly remember Fred Gutenberg, who's the father of Jamie. He's also been an outspoken member of this movement since then. He stood up at a vigil the day after he lost his daughter and said, "Media, please respect our privacy at this time. We're grieving, we're burying our children. Just give us the time and space. Give us a couple days to get through this, and then we can talk." So I would love to hear from each of you about what you kind of think about how media should navigate that line.
There is the necessity to get that breaking story, to get that coverage, but I also saw there was a lot of lines being crossed in the days after the shooting at my school. Specifically the day after at the vigil, I distinctly remember reuniting with my friends that I hadn't seen since it happened and sobbing into their arms. And then hearing the click of a camera inches away from my face, a man shoving his camera into our very intimate, very emotional moment, trying to get a picture. He then asked us to pose for a picture, tried to get us to smile. It wasn't necessarily a smiling moment. And there was those small times, the times when there was a helicopter flying right over our vigil to the point where we couldn't hear the speeches that the grieving parents were giving. And that was when I became a little bit disillusioned with journalism. And since then, I've become just as passionate as I was before this about the topic as a whole, but it was this lack of empathy that I saw. It was this lack of understanding that we're human beings and we're going through a horrible grieving process, something that no person should ever go through. And yes, it's important to cover that, but it's also important to know that you need to step back. You need to recognize that we're people too. We're going through something, and this isn't something where we can just stand there for a camera all the time. It's knowing privacy, it's knowing boundaries, it's respecting us.
And Laura, you've done an actual study on this.
Yes. Again, we interviewed 19 journalists from the state of Oregon who covered the UCC shooting. Of those 19 journalists, 16 of them had never covered a mass shooting or a mass tragedy before. So when you're a journalist, what do? News happens, it breaks, you show up, and what do? Muscle memory clicks in. And what you do is you cover the mass shooting or the tragedy exactly the same way as you cover everything else. What do? We look for color. We call them details. We call them color. And color from a mass shooting, there's something about that orientation that makes me uncomfortable. What do? We ask people questions. We look for people. How do we know somebody wants to talk? That's much easier to determine at a city council meeting or at the opening of the swimming pool or at a sporting event as opposed to someone who's been traumatized. I've learned a lot about trauma, and I don't know a ton, but how does someone consent to an interview? How are you sure you want somebody to talk? How are you sure that's going to happen? So you learn this on the job. You don't have time to think about it all the time. More than half of the journalists who we interviewed, they said they would not want to answer the questions that they were asking people. So to Delaney's point, if you listen to the journalists who cover this, they're uncomfortable with the way the coverage unfolds, but no one knows how to stop it, and it kind of takes on a life of its own. Barack Obama mentioned the routinization of coverage. Somehow this has become routine. I can still see him pounding on a podium when he said that. It was a really important moment for me, and it's part of why we decided to pull that coverage apart and find out how it happens. If people know, day one, we're going to have a lot of mistakes, and then we're going to do this. Day two, let's do a TikTok. Let's figure out what happened in the room. Day three, who are the heroes? Let's talk about the heroes. Day four, let's go to this. It's the same thing. So people tune out, and they become desensitized to it. We further traumatize the victims. One of the students at UCC said that the media, and I have the direct quote, "There was honestly a lot of harassment from the media to tell our stories. Honestly, the media was probably the second trauma almost for us." So that's a pretty powerful statement, especially because every journalist we interviewed said that they went to cover the shooting because They wanted to hold officials responsible if that was necessary. They wanted to make sure the survivors' stories were told. They wanted to make sure the victims weren't forgotten. They wanted to make sure that heroes' stories were told and that the community could help to heal. And the community didn't think that was happening. So there's a disconnect between what journalists want to do and what we are doing, and it's important to think about that.
Yeah. You know, I sympathize quite a bit with newsrooms that are facing that pressure to just get on the story and do what they have to do. At The Trace, we're lucky because we are not a breaking news shop. We exist to add context and to investigate the issue. And so our practice has always been to, in high-profile incidents, is to point directly to the local news outlet. At this point, I've covered San Bernardino, Colorado Springs, Umpqua, Orlando, Las Vegas, and in every case, the local media was giving us all the information that we needed to do our job. We call ourselves a day 2 and day 3 shop. And so I think there maybe is a lesson there for other newsrooms to think about who else is already doing the legwork that you're sending your folks out to do, and how can we not repeat those practices, particularly when they can have such negative impact.
And that's another theme that we've already heard emerging from the conference so far is collaborative journalism. What can we do? How can we work together more to make sure that we're not all swarming the same person for an interview and making them relive that trauma over and over again? So another aspect that we talked about is how camera crews leave after a couple of days or a week. Not a lot of them stay or invest in long-term coverage of the communities. So Lori, how do you see that as affecting our general coverage?
So I think there's a couple pieces here that I'm going to tweet out some recommendations after this panel, but I am going to point out Dave Cullen's book, Columbine, which I think should be a must-read for every journalist, no matter what you cover. And he covered Columbine when it happened and went back a decade later and wrote a book, and much of what he wrote was wrong. People are under trauma. We don't know what happened yet. We don't have all the details. A lot of stuff's not there. But when that stuff becomes cemented in the record, it becomes part of the way we know of the event, and we may be wrong. What most people know about Columbine is false. And Dave Cullen's book explains that very well. So by all of these front-end resources that we've invested on the front end, we don't have the story that fast. These are stories that unfold slowly. There's a lot of confusion, there's trauma, there's grief, and we don't know what happened. And in our hurry to get the story, we're missing the story in a lot of ways. I spent 3 days last week, at a conference for victims of mass violence. And that was district attorneys, police, firefighters, victim advocates, people who had responded, and many people from mass shootings from the past 20 years talking about their experiences. And all of them talked about how long it takes. When the Red Cross comes in and sets things up, there's an immediate response. It then changes to what they call a family assistance center, and that's there for about 10 to 14 days. And then they consciously transition to something they call a family resilience center. And they know that's not going to go away. That resilience is the hardest part, that recovery is the hardest part, but the news media is long gone by then. So we're not seeing what it's really like to live through a trauma like that. I have a student in one of my classes right now who was a freshman at Thurston High School in 1998. And when we discussed my Reporting Roseburg project in class, she had a physical reaction 20 years later. So these are long-standing. Recovery doesn't happen right away. And by coming in and leaving quickly, we're not showing people what it's really like.
Delaney, is there anything you want to add about media kind of parachuting into Parkland and then leaving?
I mean, as a student journalist, I was incredibly aware of how the media cycle worked, and I distinctly remember telling plenty of other students, the cameras are going to be here for 2 weeks, then they're going to leave. There will be another story that they'll have to cover, and we will be left here to fend for ourselves. And at that point, it became this rat's race to try and get the cameras to stay, to have something happening so that they would be interested enough to cover us, to keep paying attention to this issue, because it wasn't something that we could let go away. Oftentimes, people see it for the 2 weeks and they feel bad for us, but once it stops being covered, they forget about us. They don't realize that this is something that we can't forget about. This is something that we carry with us for the rest of our lives. In many ways, we don't often know. I didn't realize how traumatized I was until there was triggers happening, until I was talking to Nancy Pelosi on the Capitol floor and I heard a buzz that sounded like a fire drill and immediately went into panic mode, fearing for my life, thinking, I'm going to die. It's moments like that, moments that people don't often see, that show the permanence of something like this, that show the effect that it has on every single person involved. My school had over 3,000 students, and every single one of them was traumatized in some way or another. No matter where they were in the building, that is something that will never leave them, and that's something that the media oftentimes doesn't show. It's something that nobody really gets to know because this is a lifelong process of recovery, of grief, and of trauma. It's not just 2 weeks and it goes away.
One of the interesting things about the aftermath of the Stoneman Douglas shooting, though, is that you guys did get the cameras to stay, and you kind of had this loud, sustained voice over the last 6 months now. So can you talk about the strategy and the brainstorming that went into that?
A lot of our strategy did come about very organically. It was a lot of just intuitively knowing what we cared about, what we were passionate about, and what the media would respond to. Sadly, it's something that we'd seen many times before, covered in different ways, but ultimately to not the effect that it was in our situation. It was something that we knew what the messaging was that would be successful. We knew that if we called out legislators directly and aggressively, that it would get some attention. We realized that it was something that we had to create a movement out of because it was an issue that permeated every aspect of our country. If you look at the issue of gun violence, it affects so many different aspects of our country. It could be education, it can be domestic violence, it's equality, civil rights, all of it. And that was something that we recognized. It was something that we knew intuitively, but also that we learned over time. And it grew organically. It became a grassroots movement that grew into something so much more. But the strategy was completely internal. Oftentimes, they even asked me today, we're assumed to be media trained. We're not. We've never been trained by the media. Everything that we do is what we know, what we've learned, and what we discuss with each other. Because we know the best way to reach the people around us. They're our peers, specifically young people. And they understand what we're saying because we're saying it to them and we're directing our message to them. It's talking on an organic way, not in a way that's forced or contrived. It's purely out of the heart.
Akoto, you've already mentioned that mass shootings are actually a small fraction of what makes up gun violence in America. So what are the other issues that journalists should be looking at if they want to cover this differently?
Sure. I just want to make a quick note about what Delaney just said. We partnered with the analytics firm, I think a couple of months ago, to sort of look at media coverage post-Parkland. And the research suggests that this strategy has actually worked to help keep the issue in the news over time, more so than after other mass shootings. So I just wanted to plug that quickly. Yeah. With all the umbrellas of gun violence that I mentioned earlier, there's so much to unpack, enough to keep a full newsroom like ours busy 24/7. But I think there are some particular threads that media would do good to cover more and to pull more.
How big is the trace, by the way? How many staffers?
We are 16, 15, 16, between 15 and 16 right now. I'm looking at my colleague for confirmation, but yeah. So, number one, about the high rates of homicide amongst Black and brown men and boys in cities across the country. So we all know, or if you're not aware, that gun violence since the 90s has indeed trended down. But there are still some blocks in some neighborhoods in big cities that experience rates of gun violence that, quite frankly, should just rattle all of us, right? And so criminologists call this, they have a term for it, it's called murder inequality. And it's the idea that by virtue of just being on a particular block in a particular neighborhood, that you are exposed to a risk that is just unseen in many, many other places in the country. And so journalists should understand, particularly when we see the sensationalizing of Chicago, right, which is something that Trump very early on in the White House and the administration very early on was pointing to as like a war zone and a murder capital. I think journalists should understand that looking at the city level is not enough, and that America's gun violence story is really at that neighborhood and even sometimes block level. And because gun law and policy is so drastically different on state and local level that there's just tons of journalism that regional and local papers can be doing about that particular issue. So back to mass shootings, which is something that I mentioned is only less than 2% of our gun deaths, but they are horrific and deserve all of our attention. And we've all seen some version of the headline. This is the 100th or 150th mass shooting in any given time. And I think that journalists should start thinking about what's really behind that number. So the FBI defines a mass killing as 4 or more killed in a single incident. By that threshold, a huge chunk of the mass shootings that we see on any given year are domestic violence, intimate partner, family violence related. So these are incidents where a gunman, typically a man, will go into the home, shoot a current or former partner. If that partner has a new love interest, will shoot that person. In some cases, will shoot the children involved and other family members involved. And that makes up a large chunk of what we see when we talk about the increasing frequency of mass shootings, right? So in a lot of ways, America's mass shooting problem is a domestic violence one, and we need to think about how to cover that better. Third, I think that we're just beginning to understand what it means to survive a shooting, to be hit by a bullet and survive a shooting. 38,000 people die each year from gun violence. Anywhere between 70 and 85 survive each year. And we're just getting to understand what that means for mental health, PTSD, social mobility, financial stability. And I have a colleague, Elizabeth Van Brocklin, who has done a lot of pioneering work in understanding the challenges that gunshot survivors face. And I think she sums it up nicely when she says that before she started covering survivors, she would see a shooting in the news, see the number of fatalities and see the number of survivors and have a bit of relief for those who survived. 2 years after covering survivors, she no longer feels that sense of relief when she sees how many people are survived, because she has an understanding of what it means to survive a shooting, all the obstacles they will face, and how in many ways surviving is just the very beginning of a very long, drawn out and challenging journey that there isn't often a lot of infrastructure or support for.
That's interesting. And Lori, I believe you've mentioned different classifications, right, of
Yes.
victims.
The victim advocate who's working in Douglas County, Oregon, which is where Umpqua Community College is, says that they always refer to 3 groups: the victims, the physically harmed, and the non-physically harmed. And if you start to branch out those circles, that's a very large circle. And most of our focus in the news media is on the deaths, and that's understandable. But when we come in quickly and go away, we're not there long enough to see what some of these longer recovery, the stories of resilience. If you look up restorative narrative, which I think is a powerful way of telling a story and looking at a story, I think that really matters, to try to find ways to spend some time and to understand that it's messy and complicated. There aren't any simple answers to any of this, and I think that's really important.
Let's talk about media coverage of perpetrators. So there's both academic study of the contagion of glorifying a shooter, and there's been a movement from March for Our Lives and other communities to give no notoriety, is the phrase, I believe. And the way that the Trace newsroom is set up is different. But Delaney, do you want to talk about the no notoriety movement?
Yes, so essentially with no notoriety, it's something that grew out of a realization after the shooting at our school that oftentimes, when there is nothing else to cover, they will jump to covering the person who committed the crime, who committed the horrible act that they did. It'll show their face, they'll show their words, they'll show their name, they'll talk about them. But ultimately, that's not the story that we want to tell. That's not where we want the narrative to be focused, because all that does is re-traumatize us and give some small incremental knowledge to the public. Knowledge that doesn't change anything, it doesn't take back what happened, it doesn't heal anyone. It simply adds a little bit more to a story that shouldn't be told. To know the shooter's name for the pure purpose of knowledge, of education, that's fine. But to focus on them and their journey and their path, that's not what this is about. This is about focusing on the victims, the survivors, the heroes, every person that was affected by it. There's 3,500 kids who each have their own story. Why focus on the one that was horrible, the bad story, the bad person who committed this crime, this act. So we've pushed for no notoriety. It's something that we've had to realize as we've seen more and more of our local newspaper publishing a picture of the shooter from our school on the front page, or putting his name in bold, or releasing a video of his confession, him talking to himself in a locked room. These are things that ultimately just hurt us more and help no one. And it's something that we feel very passionate about. It is controversial at times because many times outlets do want to cover this, but there's a difference between the knee-jerk reaction of getting the breaking news, of getting that headline and the full, complete story, and adding to something that doesn't need to exist in the first place.
I think this is my cue, correct?
Yes.
I want to talk about the social science research, and I want to be clear. Peer-reviewed social science research that criminologist Adam Lankford, who you all should all know, says is essentially indisputable, and that is that news media coverage plays a role because a large percentage of mass shooters want attention, and they get attention through us, and they get attention through our coverage. This is essentially indisputable evidence that news media coverage of the perpetrator encourages attention seekers, 1, to attack, 2, to kill as many people as possible, and 3, it does inspire contagion and a copycat effect. Of the 20 deadliest mass shootings since 1998, according to Lankford's research, 11 of them can be classified as attention seekers or copycats. And this high standard of evidence comes from statements from the perpetrators themselves, or in a manifesto or in something like that, or in their contact with the news media. So this is not speculation, this is real. You can build a direct line from Columbine to Virginia Tech to Roanoke to Umpqua Community College. The shooter, the perpetrator at UCC wrote, "It seems the more people you kill, the more you're in the limelight." The shooter at Parkland, "When you see me on the news, you'll all know who I am." There was a 300% increase in violent threats and incidents at schools after the news coverage of Parkland. Again, from some studies, essentially, the bombers of the Boston Marathon received $10 million in free publicity. The Charleston church shooter, $17 million in free publicity. Look, I'm a journalist. I come to this from the newsroom. I've covered mass traumas and mass shootings in the past, and I understand that part of the who is the name of the person who does this. But we can describe a who. We don't have to put the name in a headline. We don't have to put the name in the lead every single time. We don't have to write every incremental story. If there is any chance, and there is, that news media coverage is playing any small part, we need to re-examine what we do. And we need to do it in a journalistic way where it's about getting the news out to people. I also want to address what Delaney said about photos of the shooter. My colleague Nicole Dahman has done research into this, and she looked at nearly 5,000 front page photos after Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, and UCC. The ratio of photos from perpetrator to victim, from Virginia Tech, 42-1. 42 photos of the perpetrator for every 1 photo of a victim. For Sandy Hook, 3-1. For UCC, 15-1. I don't know if that's because there's a lot of reasons for that, and I think some of them are honestly just logistical. It takes time to identify the victims. It takes time to make an official death notification. It takes time for all that to happen, filling the blanks. What's quicker is the perpetrator. What's quicker is a photo of the perpetrator. I think we really need to think about just slowing down and not jumping in to fill space with that, not feeling the need to put every single time we run a story, oh, we need a visual, here's the mugshot of the perpetrator. I think we need to be, I'm not saying we're directly responsible for this. It's a complicated issue, but we as journalists are a part of the problem, and we need to acknowledge that.
Can I actually, I wanted to share, it's an experience that happened recently that I feel kind of encapsulate Can't say it. It's fine. You know what I'm saying. It captures pretty much the message that I'm trying to send here. A few weeks ago, there was a story released about the Parkland shooter and how he walked around his house singing along to the song Pumped Up Kicks by Foster the People and pretending to shoot things in the house. This is a story that was purely focused on that one statement, an entire article released in the Sun Sentinel about that. A few days after that happened, there was a post circulating on Snapchat, something my sister saw, of a man, a teenage boy, holding a gun saying the initials of a school and then "you're next." It was something that ended up keeping my sister home from school that day because the abbreviation of the school was the same as my sister's middle school, my 12-year-old sister's middle school. It was a fear that she had that somehow on her Snapchat stories, there was people reposting this picture of a man holding an AR-15 threatening to shoot up a school. Days after this article. I'm not saying that the two are connected, but I know for a fact that after the shooting at my school, there was many posts on Snapchat, on Instagram, on every form of social media of people joking even about how their school was next, posting pictures of them holding both real and fake guns, saying that they're going to be the next Parkland shooter. It's an epidemic that I've seen many a time before, and even if it's not entirely the media's fault, it is something that you can play a role in. It's something that you can help heal rather than contribute to.
Can I also point out that we do withhold names. We do not report names of victims of rape or sexual assault as a general rule. We do not publicize suicides. We don't cover them, to the point that I've had people who are working to raise awareness of suicides say that journalists have gone too far in one direction, that we don't cover things and we're not reflecting what's happening there. But again, based on research, based on understanding, based on wanting to not be a part of the problem, we do withhold names for good reasons. And I think we need to think about that in the instance of these fame-seeking mass shooters.
I think a lot of this conversation dovetails nicely with the conversation this morning, the keynote from Dana Boyd. If you guys didn't see that, I highly recommend you going back to watch that or listen to it, because she addressed a lot of these issues, including the fact that what newsrooms choose to amplify, to cover, but also amplify, is subjective. That is a subjective act. And so there are decisions that we can make, there are things that we can do, there are practical ways to improve this reporting and process that I think we can all be cognizant of, and that's like a practical takeaway for everybody today. I know at Now This, we've had conversations even evolving over the last 4 years of mass shootings that I've been there, where we went from being very strategic and thoughtful about the way that we cover perpetrators, naming them, identifying them for newsworthiness, but making a conscious decision to not necessarily cover a manifesto that might emerge, or to, as Dana Boyd was talking about this morning, project people essentially down rabbit holes of hate that they could easily get lost in, but more responsibly and ethically cover the victims and what's happening to these communities. So we have a couple more things to get through. I know we'd love like a solid 90 minutes to talk about all of this, but I want to make sure you guys get a chance to ask questions. So just a couple more questions from me, and we'll open it up to the audience. I also want to address race and the inequality that we see in race and gun violence. What are your thoughts about what we can do to improve our coverage there? Who wants to go first?
I mean, I could talk about the March for Our Lives and our focus on inclusivity and intersectionality within our movement, because we are a movement that was born out of a school shooting. We are a movement that was originally largely affluent white students speaking out, having the cameras turned towards them, but that's not enough. It never was enough, because we weren't the only issue of gun violence in the country. It's something that has perpetrated so many other communities besides us on a much more daily basis. When you go to the cities, like you were saying, Chicago, Detroit, New Orleans, all of these areas, there is gun violence that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. They're living in fear for their lives, walking in the street, pretty much anywhere they go. And that was something that we were incredibly aware of going in, but that only became more and more important as time passed. And we brought on students from other areas of the country, students with different experiences that were just as powerful as ours, who hadn't been given the platform that we were. We strategized, and we ultimately knew that telling a camera, pay attention to this person, isn't enough. Telling a news outlet, you need to cover that, isn't enough. So we made the decision to, say in Chicago, only do interviews if we were allowed to bring along a local student. We would go to these events, we would go to these locations, and the cameras would follow us because we were oftentimes the story, but we knew that if we shared our platforms, if we brought the cameras and we pointed them in the right direction and we gave them no other choice but to cover the stories that we wanted to be told, that we could become more effective and inclusive as a movement, because ultimately we are only a small fraction of the gun violence that our country experiences, and it's a huge systematic issue that can only be solved by looking at it from every single angle.
To underscore one of your points, last week we ran a piece where we interviewed teachers about how they're dealing with being educators in this era of mass shootings and bulletproof backpacks and whatnot. And one teacher who was based in Watts said, frankly, that his kids and he as an educator, he's just not worried about mass shootings at all. He's worried about what happens when his students leave school. And his students come to school to feel safer, and school is a place for them to sort of escape the violence that they confront nearly every day in the neighborhoods they live in. But in terms of doing better about covering race, we know that this issue disproportionately impacts African Americans and Latinos. We know that Black men make up 6% of the population, but they're nearly half of all homicide victims in this country. And I think that we can do a better job of trying to understand what the information needs are of people who live in these neighborhoods. There's a lot of talk about local journalism, lots of talk about engaging audiences, but I don't think as an industry that we do a very good job of just trying to fill information needs for people who are dealing with this epidemic. What do moms who are trying to keep their kids safe need to know? I do not have answers to these questions, and I don't even know if these are questions that these folks would be asking, but I think that we have not even done the legwork to try to understand how do we serve them? How do we serve them and what they're dealing with, and not just in a way that's extractive or that's in a way that just tells others what they're going through. It's one thing to report on a community, but I think that we have a lot of work to do in terms of using journalism as a tool to serve people who are dealing with this every day and giving them practical information that they need.
And I would say as well that we just need to shut up and listen. Journalists talk to other journalists, and that's how we learn things. A lot of the professional development and continuing education in our field isn't formalized. It's at conferences like this, if you can afford to come to them and spend the time. It is mentoring. It is almost an apprenticeship model by somebody who, we saw this over and over again in Roseburg, that the older, more experienced reporters looked out for my students, looked out for the young alumni who I knew who were there. But that's not a formal training program, and it's also all contained within a journalistic community. We're here to serve the public. So if we just listen, and even like Dakota's talking about, what if you want to see what moms are doing or what's going on? Don't go in and ask questions for a story. Just go in and sit and listen and think what you might do differently. Think about stuff. Listen and be prepared to be maybe angry. Be prepared to say, well, that can't work. That's not how we do things in journalism. We can change things. The things have changed. We have a better understanding of what happens now. At the mass violence conference I was at last week, over and over, what people said was, these incidents aren't like everything else that we deal with, so we treat them differently. And we need to do that as journalists as well. And sitting and listening and having a sense of what we might be able to do. I've been listening to Delaney for part of the morning, and I know a lot more than I did when I showed up here at this conference this morning. Do I agree with everything she says? Not 100%. Do I have some more questions? I sure do. But boy, I'm learning a lot from that, and I think that's really important. I'm just going to stop there.
On the subject of shut up and listen, one of the videos that Now This did out of Parkland that had probably the most positive reaction from the audience and even people in the industry was a video that we did. I don't know if you're familiar with Cameron Caskey. He's also one of the higher profile students out of this movement. But he has a brother, Holden, his younger brother, who is autistic. And we did a video about how autistic students have to prepare for mass shootings and how much more challenging it is for them. An undercovered issue, one I hadn't heard a lot about before that. And that video got an amazing response from parents everywhere, because what people need to understand about special needs students is that if a SWAT team enters a classroom and starts yelling instructions, that student may not understand exactly what to do, and they're therefore even more in danger if the police aren't aware of that situation. And the reason that we did that story is because Holden's father, Jeff Caskey, pitched it to me. He said, hey, you're here, here's something I never see covered in the aftermath of mass shootings or school shootings. Would you consider doing a story about this? And I listened to him, and we did it, and we're very proud of that piece. So that's definitely something I think we can all learn from. But let's take some audience questions. If you guys have some, we've got 4 microphones. You had something you want to add?
While we're waiting for that question, I also
Yeah.
want to say one more thing, is that of the 19 journalists who covered the UCC shooting, and there were more journalists, these were just the 19 that we tracked down, none of them were formally debriefed about what happened to them. I want to say that again, none of them. All other type of first responder people, police, fire, victim advocates, district attorneys, people who work with us, there is a mental health need and a learning need, and I want to really stress the mental health need. Every one of the 19 journalists who we interviewed, and we talked to them for between 45 minutes and 2.5 hours each, everyone thanked us. No one had ever listened to them go through. No one had ever taken the time to really go through this in a formal way and say, what bothered you? Why did this bother you? What can you do? Being proactive about this in your newsrooms, having a plan ahead of time. People are afraid to volunteer that they want to talk to a therapist, that they need to talk to a counselor. That's not the macho way of doing things in a newsroom, right? I want to get the next story. I don't want to let my editor think I can't hack it. That's really important. I think there's a growing awareness of that, but everyone else who's involved in these kind of mass shooting and mass trauma incidents knows the importance of debriefing and of checking back not just the next day, but later. Informally, that happens everywhere. I hear tons of stories about experienced journalists reaching out to younger and back and forth. I know there's kind of a chain of command, from mass shooting to mass shooting. The students at the student newspaper at Umpqua Community College heard from student journalists from other schools. There's this underground network, but this needs to be formalized, and it's important, and it matters for the health of the individual journalists and for the health of our profession.
All right, audience questions. We've got a couple microphones in the back here, if you guys wouldn't mind going there so we can hear you clearly. Yes.
More of a comment, but I would like to hear your thoughts. So I'm with a Canadian news organization, and we often marvel that while you do cover as part of the follow-up what the politicians are or are unwilling to do in terms of gun control, we don't see a lot of coverage about America's fixation with guns. And I don't just mean a fixation in terms of ownership, but the paranoia that the government is coming to take their guns, the need to stockpile. And we could, sitting there up north, we kind of marvel that the coverage never seems to quite go in that direction or delve into the psychology of gun ownership here. And to us it appears it's less about guns and more about nobody's going to tell me what to do with my guns, and I'd appreciate your comment on that.
We've reported on that a little bit. The NRA has done a lot of work in the past few decades to promote gun ownership as a means to protect yourself from the other, right? Fear of terrorists, fear of immigrants, fear of burglars, even though the data suggests that there is much less of that sort of crime happening. Right. And so, I think that a lot of what you mentioned is really about the ways in which the gun lobby has been able to shift the narrative and literally change the primary reason for why people own guns in America. 30 years ago, it was for sportsmanship. Now it's for self-defense. And when you ask people what they're afraid of, they're often pointing to things that are not that prevalent. And so, yeah.
I think that's a great point, though, and that's another interesting part of this conversation is this is a uniquely American problem, and newsrooms should be reporting on it as such. And I think we have seen after the 150th mass shooting in however many months, people will look at the statistics for mass shootings in other developed countries, rates of gun ownership, and all of those charts show you that America, we're the only ones who have this problem. I'll let Delaney make a quick comment, and then I want to go to the next question.
To comment on the NRA thing, my father received an invitation to join the NRA in the mail, and it specifically said, our rights are being threatened by gun grabbers. And they were distinctly referring to us because it happened soon after the march. But we've focused on with our narrative that thankfully is being promoted by so many media outlets that really just want to tell our story. We can control it in a way to shift the culture around guns. Because as much legislation as you want to pass, it is important to recognize that this is a much deeper issue than just passing a few laws, because it's changing the way that people see gun violence, the way that people see gun reform as a whole. It's a lot about being very careful with the words that you choose rather than gun control saying gun violence prevention, because ultimately this is a huge issue that is specifically American that we can't just address with legislation, but that we have to address with a complete social and cultural shift. And that's really what we've been focusing on in communicating with people who might disagree with us and showing them the reality of the situation and showing them how simple this can really be when you just listen to each other.
Let's go to microphone number 3 over here.
Okay. Hi, yeah, it's interesting just building on that as the American problem. My name is Robin Shepard. I'm the Media Relations Director at Amnesty International USA, and coincidentally, we just issued a report yesterday framing gun violence as a global gun violence in America specifically as a global human rights crisis. And as it's not something we came to right away, we've been doing years of research with people on the ground to document exactly how relentless the reality is, survivors, DV, et cetera. But my concern and what I would love to hear insights about is now we have our international sections, Amnesty Sweden, Amnesty Kenya, Amnesty Japan, looking at us about how to tell this story as more than just, look at the American freak show. We want to let them know about the reality of the ground and tell the stories of the people we've been talking about, but also in a responsible way. So if you have any insights on how to take these stories to an international audience without diminishing or overshadowing or overwhelming the decades of work of people on the ground.
That's a great question.
I mean, something that we've noticed a lot is that when you are addressing on a more international level, you have to tailor your message, because we can't talk about the gun violence that we experience and get the same reaction out of somebody who lives in Australia that we can from someone who lives in America. And for us, what we've largely realized is that it's better to communicate with people on a level that they understand. I recently went to a youth summit in New Zealand, and that's an issue that has no prominence in New Zealand, but they had a huge suicide issue. They didn't talk about mental health at all in their country, and I was communicating this to a group of students that they can get engaged on that. It's just not, it doesn't have to be about one issue, it has to be about recognizing the systemic issues within your own country and realizing that the best way to do that is engaging in your democracy, engaging in your government. And that's really the message that we've been pushing, is that while you may not experience gun violence in your country, it's not just look down on America for having this problem, it's see what problems are in your country that you can relate to, that you can sympathize with and empathize with to really just best fix every problem in our world.
I want to keep going because we have a lot of questions, but Robin, I would love to talk to you more after about this question. I think it's a great question. Yes, right here.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I go to Lehigh in Pennsylvania, and Delaney, I was at the March for Our Lives, so I'm with you there. So you guys talked, first of all, great panel, but you guys talked a lot about what media shouldn't do in situations. So do you have any tips of what we should do? Because the vast majority of people don't know what this experience is like and want to get it right. I think that the vast majority mean well, but we don't want helicopters ruining your vigil. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, we saw a lot of the bad. I talked a lot about the bad in the media, and we did see a lot of that, but there was also a lot of good that I saw that oftentimes I don't really get the opportunity to speak about. But there was a photojournalist that came on tour with us, and she told us, because we invited her on, she told us that this wasn't about just covering the march, this was about covering the people and really understanding who we were and what our entire story was. And it's about empathy in journalism. It's about really just not going for the story, but going for the entirety of the experience, going for the people and really what they have to say. It's about shutting up and listening, because ultimately this is our story to tell, and rather than framing it around a certain narrative, around a certain goal, just let them speak. Just try and get a genuine, true story out of it. Don't have it framed so that it seems like we are automatons spouting information, but really just grasp the humanity in it, because that's what's going to make people empathize more. That's what's going to really get into their heads and into their hearts.
So,
Real quick, because I know you have some actual data and things. But I will just say that I think that if you are a newsroom that only covers gun violence during a mass shooting or in the wake of one, then there's probably way more that you can do. This is a uniquely American problem that touches many, many corners of this country. And so, you know, there are many, many gun violence stories, things that national organizations need to know about how things work on a state and local level. You know, crime stats and about the nature of gun crime in your particular jurisdiction. I think that's something that newsrooms can do. Just dedicate yourselves to covering this issue beyond the shootings that make the headlines.
So a couple things. First of all, make a plan now. None of the newsrooms, other than people who had covered it, but even national outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, they jumped into action every time when Umpqua Community College shooting happened. But if you have a plan now, the people, the first responders, they train for this, and they don't show up with something, so that they're thinking ahead of time, what would we do, so you're not making a decision in the moment that might have a problem. I teach news values. I'm a journalism teacher. I teach basic reporting classes, and I teach who, what, where, when, why, and I teach the big picture questions, how, so what. The questions I've also begun asking my students to consider as news values are, first of all, what's possible? What's possible now? Like a big time brainstorming thing, what could be happening? And another question I think is really important is who's missing? If we look at the kind of coverage that's out there, who's not reflected in that, who's there? And if you start thinking about that stuff ahead of time, as hard as that is, I know deadline, I know how it works, I'm a procrastinator and a journalist, but the more prep you do ahead of time, that happens. Break the routine, look at those stories. I mean, everybody knows what stories are going to happen what day. They're not advancing this story. So if you look at the trace and you look at someone who's doing this and say, how can we do this in my newsroom, that makes a difference. And listen to people, look at the victims. Build relationships, I think, with public safety officials. They know a lot more, and they can help you start to see some of the pieces and some of the complexities that are there. And I would also say to learn more about trauma in general. I teach sports media classes. My classes at the university covers all of the track and field at Hayward Field at the University of Oregon. Every class I teach, we have a plan in case there is a mass casualty at a track event. Thank God there's never been one. It scares the bejesus out of the students, and I usually send them out outside to run around the building afterward. But we have a plan. And if you think about those plans all the time, it's putting you where you're not reacting to coverage, that you are making decisions ahead of time. And I think those are good ways to think through it.
All right, number 4, you've been standing up for a while.
Thanks. So I'm Jeremy. So on the conversation of respecting victims after mass shootings, obviously super important. I also think certain lawmakers and media figures will say some of the things to try to shift the conversation away from reform and gun control. So I guess my question is, how do we as journalists balance being respectful while also telling the victim stories and keeping things like that in the national spotlight?
I think accountability in that sense is really important. So politicians have agendas, of course, and I think one of the problems with gun violence coverage in America has been the success of the NRA and other politicians in framing it as a political or even partisan issue, when really it's a human rights issue, like Amnesty International says, or it's a public health issue. That's how we should be framing it. So I think newsrooms can do a lot more to push that narrative forward. Again, speaking of amplification, maybe not giving oxygen to some of the more outlandish or less factual statements that lawmakers can make. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I mean, yeah, I think politicians lie a lot. And so if you're in the business of journalism, you're also in the business of facts. And I think that you can push back on a lot of those half-truths or imprecise statements by just sharing the facts and what we know about how this crisis persists.
And what's a news value, right? Is it news value just because somebody who is a prominent politician said it? Is it actually news? Is it advancing the conversation? Is it a talking point? Is it relevant? We're not obligated to print everything everybody says. We're not obligated to broadcast everything everybody says. We have choices to make, and often our choices, I believe, are tilted toward public officials, right? Because they put out statements, because they're there, because they're prominence. I teach prominence as a news value, but we leave a lot of people behind when we only focus on prominence. So, again, I would encourage you to go out and listen to the community and ask what people are saying and see what's going on in a way that you don't have to regurgitate other people's talking points.
All right, let's go back to number one. Let's see what we can fit in.
All right, hi there. I work at a publication called Refinery 29, and we have an audience that's really passionate about the topic, but I do a lot of work with our social media team, and I'm curious if you guys can talk a little bit about ways to leverage social media in a positive way to help continue the conversation and strategies to help so that the conversation doesn't get out of control on these types of platforms from what you've seen.
Delaney, this one's all you.
As some of you may know, our movement did grow largely out of social media. It was a privilege that we had to gain the platforms that we did quite quickly. And a lot of us are, Twitter-brained. We're kind of just raised in that culture where we really know how to fire out a tweet that can be really successful. But something that I noticed was that with social media, we were able to share our message without any manipulation, any editing. And because, of course, when you're covering a story, you have to choose which quotes you're using. But when we're choosing the quotes that we're using, when we're choosing what message we want to be heard, it can inherently be more direct. It can feel a lot more connecting than seeing us on a camera or hearing a quote from us in an article. And really, it's about the intersection of social media and journalism and how organizations like Now This have used social media to their advantage in a way that is visually and engaging, and it's stimulating, and it catches the eye, but it educates them. And I think that really is where the next field of journalism can just continue to move into, because that's what people are on nowadays. That's what young people are on, especially with an organization like Refinery 29, which I'm pretty sure every young person knows about. It's literally like I've read so many things from Refinery 29, and I know about that because of social media, because I'm seeing it on my Twitter feed, on my Instagram feed. That's really where a lot of it is born out of.
That's great. Let's go here.
So I run a national news desk, and we work with 26 TV stations, and many of them are in very conservative communities. How do you deal with the irrational audience that comes with having an audience that loves their guns?
That is a great and challenging question. One thing we didn't really get to, and another reason why I recommend Dana Boyd's talk from this morning, is Alex Jones, InfoWars, conspiracy theorists, what they do to manipulate media and conservative audiences. And she went into a fair amount of detail about that. So again, great follow-up and resource there. But yeah.
I also think
Where should we start?
Yeah, I just want to point out, I have family members who own guns. I have friends who go hunting and who do target shooting for fun, that we tend to hear the loudest voices on all sides, right? So if you can get past those loud voices, past those talking points to real people, who's missing from this story? Who are those responsible gun owners? Who are the people who have been NRA members previously? Who are the people who feel conflicted? That's happened a lot. If you look at some of the areas, when we talk about who's missing from our coverage or who's not there, rural communities are there. The people, I've talked to several people, including some people at the student media organizations at UCC, which is in a community that is heavily Republican, that has a lot of gun owners in the school, that has people there, and they had felt shut out of the conversation. They were truly honored when they saw Emma had a UCC strong patch on a jean jacket, because they feel like, because they don't fit that narrative of this, that guns do play a role in that community, that hunting does play a role in that community. I don't think we can ignore that as journalists. So I think there's a way to go deeper and get past the talking points.
Yeah, I'll add that, it's a really challenging thing. Our Facebook page is overrun by gun owners who just don't have much goodwill for what The Trace does with its journalism, because the issue is so polarized. And so one thing that I think newsrooms can do is, report on those gun owners and talk about what's interesting to them and what their perspectives are. Just before the NRA convention, we ran a series called The NRA and Me, where we had interviewed close to 10 or 15. We've spoken to 40 NRA current and former members about why they quit, why they're staying, what issues they have with the organization. And we ran it, and we got a lot of positive feedback. The NRA, who has called us many names, they had even shared it on their Facebook page without any snark, without anything. It was just a very positive, sort of well-received package, and I think that that's at least one step that news organizations can take to at least sort of get people on either side to understand that journalism is about, or journalists are just reporting facts, and we're trying to report on an issue and not necessarily trying to take a side.
Oftentimes I find it is a matter of misinformation and manipulation. I consider NRA TV to be propaganda because they call us, the March for Our Lives, gun grabbers, communists, just so many names. And the people that we've spoken to that get their information from Alex Jones, from NRA TV, oftentimes don't understand that they agree with us, that they support safe storage laws, that they support red flag laws. It's just that they believe that we want to take away all of their guns, that we want to repeal the Second Amendment. And that's oftentimes where local news stations come in, because I know that most American news consumers don't go to CNN or Fox News, but go to their local news stations when they're reporting the actual factual information, when they are reporting the real story rather than some absurdly manipulated, these are communists that were literally going to come into your homes and take away your guns, something that I've heard before. That's where people can get the most education and more of a direct communication, because the conversations that I've had with opponents, people who disagree with us, are oftentimes the most productive because they don't realize it. They don't know what we stand for. They just genuinely believe the pure lies that Alex Jones has screamed into their faces.
All right, we've got time for one more question on the end here.
I'm Barb Barrett. I'm an editor at stateline.org. We're part of the Pew Charitable Trust, and our approach to news generally is very sort of fact-based, analytical. So we cover state policy issues from a national perspective. We're not going to get into gun control versus gun rights necessarily and all the screaming voices. So I wanted to know what tips you guys have for covering state policy issues without getting into the political back and forth, because that's not really what we're about, and what suggestions you might have.
I think that working an organization that is focused primarily on state policy is already a step in the right direction, because the issue is so large and is just vastly different from state to state, city to city. So I think that reminding people of how this issue changes depending on where you live and how someone's circumstances in Maryland could be vastly different than someone's circumstances in Florida. When people talk about the idea that there hasn't been much movement on gun reform since Newtown, that's something that people say a lot. I think you can point to the fact that in plenty of states that there has been plenty of movement. In Florida, we saw some change after Parkland. Connecticut made a lot of changes after Newtown. And so that entire area is ripe with great reporting opportunities, and is also an opportunity to tell national audiences there is movement on the state level.
Mm-hmm. I think one way to frame that as well is another thing we teach at the University of Oregon is solutions journalism, and look for things that are working, because there are places where things do work, and that can be very powerful to rigorously report something. We're still watchdogs, but to rigorously report something and say, this is why it works in this community, so that people can see something that is. Ask people what works instead of what doesn't work, and you're going to change the conversation every time, and that might lead you in some different directions.
It's a very important point. Yeah.
oftentimes people don't even know the legislation in their own state or city, and there's a lot of different ordinances and laws that have been passed that people just simply don't know about because they're not educated, because they don't have an outlet or a source that's telling them about these things. And when they're being reported to on a level that is specific to them, rather than just hearing about whatever national legislation is passed, it can become much more effective, it can become much more engaging, because oftentimes people only look for those big movements, those big laws that are passed and that giant change, but change is a small, step-by-step thing. It's something that happens on every level, and to report that on every level and show what's changing in every community, it can become incredibly more effective, and it can really put things into perspective for people.
Thank you. Well, we could go another hour. Thank you all so much for coming. We are all really, really passionate about continuing this conversation, so please tweet at us, find us online, email us. We're happy to continue answering questions. We have a hashtag. There's also an app, if you haven't downloaded it, on the back of your badge yet, called Guidebook. You can give us feedback there, and we'll be happy to look at it and take your suggestions on continuing the conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists for a great conversation today, and thank you for coming.